Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a bin right here. It's on the bench, ready to go. I'm using my tripod as sort of a selfie stick, so it's not the perfect situation, but I just figured I'd at least try to start the video with a in-person greeting. I got a little bit of information here. This is a tiny little thing with information on it. Usually I'll use a pretty good sized board that's got all this stuff on it, so I'll just read it really quick in terms of what we're dealing with here today. 224-day-old system, that's 32 weeks. I assume it's red wigglers because the worms that live in here were recruited from my compost barrel. 11 days have passed since we last fed these worms, and at that time I remember, I even reviewed the video briefly to see how things looked in here, and it did look to me like we had set up a really sweet setup for them. All kinds of nice fresh bedding, all kinds of delicious foods, and today's going to be no different. I've got a pretty nice assortment of foods that are somewhat similar to what they got last time. I think last time they were cucumber peels, and today they're getting cucumber peels again. There's also a couple of these coffee filters that I've got that we're gonna try to incorporate as supplemental bedding in the system. So we could use that old one as supplemental bedding, and we'll just use one of these as the replacement for the feeding zone indicator. Feeding zone indicator is just showing us where we last fed. Let's see, cucumber, potato peels, tomatoes, possibly a couple other things. And it's all frozen, so once this stuff starts to thaw out, it should become pretty savory for the worms. Oh, give me a moment, I gotta put a glove on. I just saw a little intruder zipping around over there. Oh. Typically I don't tolerate the centipedes in my worm bins because I know centipedes are predatory insects looking to feed on the worms. I don't know, I can't remember if they feed on the baby worms or something, maybe the cocoons or whatever. Either way, they don't do the worm bin any good. If I see millipedes, they're welcome to stay because they're a good helper and they don't mess with the worms, but the centipedes, they're fast, so it takes a little doing to catch them before they slip away. And luckily we were able to take that little guy out pretty easily. Now a lot of my systems use plastic to prevent excess moisture from leaving the system through evaporation. But you might have noticed the only things that were covering the system here were, there was like a paper bag, a sheet of newspaper, there was also the feeding zone indicator right over where we last fed. They end up leaving the top surface of the system a little bit drier than it needs to be. But you don't have to go very deep and you start getting down into portions of the bin where things are really comfortable. Last time we excavated the feeding area and bumped into lots of residual bedding that had been used in the previous feeding. So we tried to sort of blend that in a little bit, and then we went ahead and we grabbed my supply of fresh bedding and we did add more. And I guess we could do that here today. Alright, good number of worms in here. Yeah, you saw earlier the estimated population in this system somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500. But then again, that was 32 weeks ago when we first started the system. There's always a pretty good likelihood that the worms have been mating and expanding their numbers in here. So we might have more than that. It's always so tough to tell. The only thing we really got a glimpse of here was how many worms were hanging out down the center in the feeding area. And the only thing I saw was leftover bits of paper, which would have been used as the bedding in here. And the feeding they got last time was the sort of stuff that you would expect to vanish pretty quickly, so I'm not surprised that we're not bumping into any leftovers here. Besides a pretty good sized population, it was also foods that would have gotten consumed pretty rapidly, I believe. So now we did collect up a pretty nice collection of somewhat dry bedding over here. You know what we could do? I've got my little bottle here of water, but the water in this bottle is treated with the mosquito dunks to try to prevent gnats and fruit flies. So Mosquito Dunks is, you know, marketed as a preventative for mosquitoes. So you put it in your pond, or you put it into any place on your property where you're expecting standing moisture, where the mosquitoes might want to lay their eggs and try to spawn off the next generation. And the Mosquito Dunks just interferes with that whole life cycle. So here and there I've been putting the BTI solution into most of my systems to try to reduce insect numbers. And it's been working really nicely. The main systems where I've been seeing a little bit of a increase in flying insect activity are the younger systems, not this one. I don't think that this one really had too much of an issue going on. It was the younger systems where by the time they came into the wormery, by that time I had run out of my previous batch of BTI, Mosquito Dunks solution, and that just meant that a lot of systems weren't getting any. But when I first started observing the return of the flying insects, I did whip up a new batch, and I've been trying to include it in my check-ins. So we could take a couple of these as sort of a little placemat to drop the food onto. It even has a little bit of residual coffee remaining in it. We can grab this last one over here as the replacement for the feeding zone indicator. We'll actually take this nice seasoned one, and we'll include that down here in the feeding too. I'm questioning whether I want to drop in a little bit of my prepared bedding, since there does seem to be space in this system to build it out for them a bit more. And at 17 feedings now, this being its 18th feeding that it's getting today, you know, a lot of times in the past I would always treat that as pretty late in the game. At some point soon we would want to try to migrate the worms out, harvest their castings. But more and more I've been striving to somewhat increase the time span that I allow my worm bins to go, trying to increase the volume, try to increase the space for the worms so that maybe they'll, you know, increase their numbers. It'll spur on mating a little bit by them sensing that there's more room. So I don't know, maybe we can add a little bit more bedding. I've gone ahead and I've put most of the food we're gonna put in here. I've got some worm chow that we can introduce. The coffee went in. I put grit. This is pulverized eggshell that I'm using as grit. I just dropped in the grit here on top of the foods. I think as these veggies and fruits and whatever start to thaw, it'll create a good bit of moisture, and then all this coffee will probably get a good bit of traffic too. Let me get my prepared bedding. It is starting to run a little bit low, so we're not going to use up a lot of it. I'd like to save some for, well, you know, maybe I should just plan to make some more. Because it is easy enough. I've got this really nice shredder, so yeah, I could probably use a little bit more here. Why not, right? It would be nice to see the worms recognize the extra space and try to fill it with babies. So we'll just give them a nice cozy pile of bedding to place in on top of the feeding. Oh my goodness, that's a lot. So now this is my worm chow. This is just pulverized combination of seeds, nuts, grains, anything I find in the cupboard that seems like it could go. Flour, cornstarch. The recipe for this changes as I get around to preparing the next batch. It always sort of just depends on what I've got laying around here. And it is damp. I mean, not the worm chow, the prepared bedding that we're putting in here. It might not look that way, but I do prepare it with moisture to try to make it nice and cozy when I place it into the worm bin, so it doesn't just suck up all the surrounding moisture from the system. So I think we're almost done. We can cover up the feeding area at this point. And the only other thing I'd like to do before we close up shop here in this system is sort of check the outskirts of the bin too. A lot of times I just sort of come into the system, open up where we last fed, reset the feeding, if it's down the middle, and then I just sort of forget to check how things on the outskirts of the bin are doing. Sometimes I wonder if by opening up the middle I've actually driven the worms to the outer reaches. I probably have, and then it seems so impressive when you see how many worms are hanging out on the outside. But it might just be because we sort of drove them there. The castings out here are really nice, I must say. And I definitely remember that from the previous videos. The moisture level's pretty good, although it is a little bit dry out here. Or at least to me it seems that way, but it doesn't seem to be putting the worms off because they're in here and they seem comfortable and healthy. So things look pretty good over on that side. Times like this I don't mind blending in a little bit of extra surface bedding that I have on hand here when I excavate those outer edges, because those outer edges oftentimes have a fairly limited amount of bedding in them anymore. So it just doesn't seem too difficult to just give them a little bit more over there in case they need it. Because if you look at the stuff that we're pulling out, it looks like it's practically all castings. Here and there's a little bit of bedding material still scattered within it, but not a whole lot. So here and there I'll just try to introduce a bit into there before we close it up. So I don't know, it does seem like after all this time we could start driving this thing towards completion if we wanted to, or we could just do what I've been doing on a lot of my systems, is just let it ride. It's not uncommon anymore for me to actually take some of my systems up to 20 feedings, and since this is this system's 18th feeding, I'll probably still squeeze a couple more in here. If I knew I was gonna try to drive this thing to completion at some point soon, I would probably start trying to wean them off fresh bedding, kind of let them nibble down and break down what still remains in here as far as bedding is concerned, and then that would enable us to have some really nice clean castings that's not littered with all kinds of paper scraps and whatnot. So right now I'm not too worried about it, since that's not really in the cards quite yet. I'd really just rather make sure that they've got an abundance of everything they need throughout the majority of the system. And you know, maybe moisture is something that the system will be lacking on the top surface as things dry because of the somewhat flimsy coverings. But I don't mind, because it does seem to me like it does allow for a good bit of airflow in the system. And if we were to cover up with plastic, then it would create a lot more dampness all the way out onto the surface, create a lot more traffic out there too. But I don't know, I guess it's a toss-up. I like the breathability of it, so I sacrifice moisture and worm traffic on the top surface for that breathability. All right, everyone. I think that's it for our little check-in here with our 224-day-old system of red wigglers. These were the worms that were recruited from my compost barrel when my compost barrel was in need of repair. These were the worms I was able to extract from the material that had been in that system. So they're doing a great job. We had talked about maybe returning them back outside at one point in the future, but I got a feeling they've pretty much become part of my indoor composting system anymore. These guys don't have to go back outside. My outdoor compost barrels are loaded with worms. So I think these are just going to be a permanent fixture, and going forward, the number of worms in here is probably enough to launch off 2 new bins when we finally get around to harvesting. So, all right, everyone, I've got a little bit of cleaning up and putting away to do, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.